Thank you all so much for this session. Thank you for being here. I know throughout the day, climate change has been a theme that's been touched upon, but it is so important for us to do a deep dive. I mean, at this moment, there is a hurricane ravaging Puerto Rico. Last week, Mike Bloomberg was in the Virgin Islands. People in those parts of the world are questioning now, can they stay there? What is the viability? And we're also living at a time during this UN week when there are people questioning if climate change exists and whether it's a political issue or a refugee issue. We know that it does, and we'd like to find out what it means. So first, Mr. President, from your perspective, what are the impacts of climate change in your world?
Well, I'd first like to say that for Africa, we have been battling for climate change for quite a long time. You know, two examples. In 70,000 years ago, two families walked out of Africa because of climate change, to go and populate the world. But something even closer to us, and where I personally involved, is that 3,000 years ago, the Bantu people living in Nigeria had to move out of Nigeria, going towards the southern hemisphere of the continent, from Cameroon, Gabon, down to South Africa. And that was because of climate change.
Because it was not possible to live in Nigeria.
Exactly, exactly. So we go through the same thing today, but that was 3,000 years ago.
Mr. First Vice President, how do you see it?
Well, it's clear that erratic weather and what we've seen now in the Caribbean, but also in Asia, is directly linked to the rise of temperature of the water in the oceans. It is also clear that the conflict in Syria, in its origins, is also linked with drought and the lack of economic prospect for people living in Syria. It is also clear that patterns involving harvests are changing rapidly, and not just in the Middle East, not just in Africa, also in Europe. Desertification is something that's also a problem in Europe, in countries like Spain and Portugal. The drought in Portugal this year led to tragic consequences with wildfires. So, I mean, you must be absolutely blind if you don't see that this is clearly linked with climate change.
But it's not exactly clear. I think there are loads of people out there that look at Syria, for example, and they view it as politically driven and are unaware of how tied it is to climate.
Yes, and I think we have failed in providing clarity about that. I think we are under an obligation as leaders and politicians to point to the interface between different phenomena, climate change, demographic developments. The migration issue cannot be seen distinct from climate change and demographic developments and economic disparities. And at the end of the day, the problem we face globally is that the promise of convergence has not been materialized, and on the contrary, we see divergence. And divergence is the biggest driver for conflict. And divergence is also a result of different climates, different circumstances in which you can live. If we don't make a real change, one generation from now, parts of the Middle East will be literally inhabitable because of high temperatures. Humans can't survive in temperatures of 70 degrees Celsius.
Isabelle, in your industry, it's not about how you feel about climate. You have to address it. How is the energy industry addressing it?
I'm more optimistic than I've ever been, in fact, because yes, climate change is a threat multiplier. We're increasing the risk of poverty, instability, immigration, of course. But I believe the opposite is true also. I mean, if we manage to master climate change, we can do even, in fact, more than that. Because in my view, climate change is a kind of trigger. It is a threat, it is also a fantastic lever. Because if we look at that, in fact, that the very first real global challenge, I mean that the first time any decision made by anyone, anywhere, has an impact on everybody. That's the very first time. And this fact forces, in fact, in kind of solidarity and forces the fact that we finally set up a governance. And this governance, in my view, will make us able to tackle climate change, yes, but more than that, and in particular, poverty. The beauty is that this awareness provoked a massive investment in new technologies, renewable technologies, and these technologies, because they are very flexible, very easy to implement, rapid to implement, they will not only allow us to master climate change, but they will also allow us to do what is a challenge for decades, and which is, for me personally, really something which is key, which is to bring energy to everybody. So I believe our role as leaders is to look at it as a lever for action. So as a group, because that's also what you invited me to explain maybe, as a group we have decided to take our responsibilities. I run Engie, which is a global energy company of roughly $80 billion turnover in 70 countries. So we have decided to fully focus our resources on what is needed to master this dual challenge, which is, yes, battle against climate change, but also provoke development by bringing energy, which is at the very core of development. So we have decided to be a pioneer. It's extremely concrete, what I am saying. We have screened our activities. We have identified that 20% of them, they are no longer at the core of what is needed, and then we have decided to stop them, dispose them, in order to free up new resources, $15 billion, roughly, to accelerate investment in the relevant technologies, the one that will be able to master these new challenges. So I believe really that's now what is at stake. It is to go from an awareness to concrete action, individually, player by player, but also to look at the rules of the system. In my view, we have collectively to review, but that's maybe another conversation, to review some of the rules of the game in order that the efforts of everybody are aligned on what is needed.
Strive, do you share the optimism that Isabelle does? For so many of us in the United States, as it relates to climate change, it seemed in the last 4, 5, 10 years or so, there was really developments as far as companies working with the government, science was being funded, and now there's questions here. It's surprising to so many of us that climate, there are some even denying that it exists. So from your perspective, from your business perspective, how do you see things?
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Optimism is an interesting word. I think I'll allow you to conclude at the end of my remarks whether it constitutes optimism or not. I'm a telecommunications entrepreneur in Africa, and really, building cell phone networks doesn't. When there were issues of climate change, I thought of it more or less as droughts and not enough rain. But I joined the board of the Rockefeller Foundation in 2003. And one of the reasons I joined the board was I wanted to advocate for an African green revolution. Why didn't Africa have a green revolution? So it so happened that at the time a new president was coming on board at the same time, Dr. Judith Rodin. And the Rockefeller Foundation, which had been the place where Norman Borlaug worked and got his Nobel Peace Prize for work in seeds in the Asian Green Revolution, was keen to look at Africa. So we set about and we reached out to the Gates Foundation to see if we could create a partnership to try and raise production and productivity in African agriculture particularly as it regards to smallholder farmers. This kind of put me right in the middle, because having advocated for it, I was then told, okay, so you go on the board of this new institution. So we created something called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which promotes the interest of 400 million smallholder farmers. So one of my first missions in this new role, I bought myself I'm a tech entrepreneur, but I went into the rural areas with Kofi Annan. And we're traveling in rural Mali, meeting smallholder farmers who are primarily women. And I'll come back to it when we talk about other issues around climate change, like security, because there were some amazing observations. But as we talked to these smallholder farmers, and we said, what are the issues? These mostly uneducated rural women farmers. They said, Mr. Annan, it's climate change. The weather is changing. I said, are these droughts? They said, no, these are not droughts. What we need now are seeds that can help us deal with this problem. And so our work with the Alliance for a Green Revolution has been to develop new hybrid seeds that are resistant to climate change, that can deal with that. So there is optimism there, in the sense that when we accept what is happening, because you cannot solve a problem you can't accept. I'm a scientist, I'm trained as an engineer, so I'm not going to have a debate about something that is pretty obvious. The science is there, and once we realize that there is change, I believe there is still time to begin to take some radical measures to make communities more resilient, to see how we can help people, particularly the most vulnerable, who are the poorest in the world.
Mr. President, we're talking about this beautiful, inspiring idea of this African green revolution. But for someone who has to govern and lead a nation every day, is it somewhat of a romantic idea? I mean, every day you have to lead a country. How do you address these issues?
Well, first we had to explain to our people what was at stake and what we were doing. It is important for everyone to understand that we live on the same planet. We share the same, global ecosystem. If you destroy the Amazon, rainforest, you will have desertification in central USA. If you destroyed the Congo Basin rainforest, the situation will even be worse in the Sahara Desert. Yeah. For us in Africa, it's a matter of life or death, because, climate change will bring us to have, more problems when it comes to agriculture, because no water, no food. And then we're already talking about migration today. Tomorrow, it's going to be even worse. Now, what we have to consider is that man has been the problem, man will be the solution. So we still, despite what's happening, we are very optimistic about the future, because at this time, like in Africa, we're all working together. I have the privilege to chair the Head of State Committee on Climate Change, and we're trying to really work together. First, what is important for us is to make sure that all the decisions that we take, we can implement those decisions. Secondly, we have to have a strategy to mobilize financing. And third, we're trying to also improve governance, because we found that we have too many bodies between the African Union Commission, the committee that I chair, and others. And what is important is to mobilize people, but also, especially we leaders have to reach out, to the private sector, because we can't do it alone. So it'd be important for us to reach out to the private sector, providing that we also improve governance, because the money is not there. Now, how the money is going to be used, this is also important. So we have so many priorities, but we have to prioritize, the priorities. And that's not so easy for us. But really, we are reaching out, we're talking, and this time around, everybody has a possibility to work together. So we're just You know, the fact that some people are still in doubt, we not even consider that, you know. We have to be, you know, in another set of mind, frame of mind, to really work together. And I'm pleased to be sitting in the representative, you know, you and the European Union Commission, because we're working together. We're also talking, because what affects us is going to affect them to tomorrow. Exactly. No water means no food. No food, more migration. And that's going to be a big problem in the future. You know, I just started by reminding everyone that, you know, 3,000 years ago, there was already that kind of problem. You know, the Sahara Desert was not always a Sahara Desert. You know, at one point, it was rainforest. It became a desert, you know, and then drove people out. So it's just a cycle. Now today, because of technology, knowledge, we can stop that. It's just a matter of will. Are we? Will we?
Well, Mr. First Vice President, His Excellency says man created the problem and man can stop the problem. But is the problem man, or is the problem short-termism? Because we struggle, whether it's in business, for CEOs to make great long-term decisions right now. It's very difficult because they have shareholders and activist investors knocking down their door. And if it's government leaders, you've got people who are voting tomorrow who are saying, save me today, feed me today. So with short-termism affecting all aspects of leadership right now, how do we get around that as it relates to climate? Because we all can hear and believe that it's life or death, but somehow when you go out in the world, people look at it as an abstract problem, and it's not.
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem here is, and you're absolutely right, short-termism is a real political disease in our systems, especially in democracies. But behind short-termism, why are politicians becoming short-termists? Because people are pessimistic about their future. And if people are pessimistic about their future, the only concern is that they keep what they have, and they see every change as a threat to their position. And we are faced with fundamental change, because it's not just climate change, we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. Our economy is changing in a fundamental way. And this combination of climate change, which is the first real existential threat man has faced in a long time, combined with the fourth industrial revolution, offers huge challenges, but also incredible opportunities. And I think our task as leaders is to get people from the position where they tend to think that the challenges are dominant to a position where they start to accept that the opportunities could be dominant. Because it is not a technological problem. We can solve it. No. Frankly, it's not even a financial problem. We can solve that too. It's a problem of integrating everything at a global level. And I have to say, sovereignty will not bring a solution here. Only international cooperation will. And you know, this nostalgia is now quickly becoming the opium of the people, telling people that if you just go back to being a nation state, all your problems will evaporate. I mean, that's selling fairy tales to people. We need international cooperation more than ever before. And if we find forms of international cooperation, I can guarantee you we can fix this. And then we can recreate a sense of optimism in our society so that I can go home and that I can be assured that my kids look at the future with more optimism than they do today.
Well, if the goal is to come out on the right side of the trade as it relates to the fourth industrial revolution, the thing that's needed in terms of corporate or governmental leadership is thoughtfulness. Isabelle, in your work, do you have the latitude to incorporate thoughtfulness in how you plan and manage your business? Because we all love to talk about green energy and the idea of sort of this green revolution, but can you actually implement it, and is there enough opportunities to do so?
The problem of short-termism is a real one. If I can go back to that one second. That's incredible, the gap between the performance as we try to look at it, integrating, of course, financial performance, but also the ability to fit with the challenges of the communities with which we work in each country, and the performance on which I'm challenged. I can tell you I'm a listed company. I spend a lot of time in road shows, including here in New York, because a big part of our shareholders are here. And, well, we just look at financial performance. I'm a former CFO, so I won't deny that it is an important thing. It is. But it is not it's too narrow, and it is not taking into account our ability to prepare the future. Here, there is really something. I'm sure that we are making the right choices. I mean, what we are doing is not only because we are personally convinced, because we have children, because we feel accountable. It's also because it is long-term value creative, for sure. The best way to create value is to be aligned with what is really at stake. But it would be much more incitative for everybody to rapidly join the move if effectively we could have another notion of performance. That's really what I mentioned a few minutes ago, to change the rule of the game. I had that in mind. It is critical to, that's not easy, but to make that, to manage that, we can have a much broader view on what is performance, to create something which is much more virtuous and, well, value creative for everybody. Another point is, because I agree with what has been said, it's not a question of technology, it is not, even not a question of financing. Now there are, well, bottlenecks, let's say, to unlock. Just one example. A lot of money available that desperately looks at interesting projects with difficulties sometimes to find them, and a lot of very small-scale energy infrastructure that desperately look at financing. And we have to bridge the gap. We have to connect the two. And there are legal framework to revisit, regulatory questions to revisit, and to look at the system as a whole. So we tried with other CEO of big groups everywhere in the world. We funded an initiative. It is a non-for-profit association, Terawatt, well, which purposes exactly that, to identify all the bottlenecks and to come to COP23 with very concrete and ready to implement solutions. And really, I believe that we have to push that kind of regulatory efficient system, if possible the same everywhere, in order we can at scale deliver what we need to deliver. That is to say, a rapid implementation of these new technologies that are now available.
Strive, then what would your message or your plea be? Yesterday we saw the President of the United States get to stand up before the UN General Council. As it relates to climate, industry interfacing with government, how climate is affecting migration, all of it. If you had the podium, if you had that stage right now, today, this important week of global political and business leaders, what message would you want to get out?
Well, let me go back to my visit to Mali with Kofi Annan. We went there, we were wandering around rural Mali. As you know the location of Mali, in West Africa. But as we traveled, Kofi Annan said something to me which I'll never forget because it was so prophetic. He said, "Do you see the young men? They are not farmers. It's the women who are the farmers, but look at the number of young men without jobs." He says, they have two options now. They either cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean and go and look for work in Europe, or they go to the Islamist camps. He says these are the options that they have. So we were gone out of Mali maybe a year. The government was overthrown, And you all know the story. It needed African Union troops and French troops to prevent the overrun of the capital city by Islamist groups that came through. So this is a nexus of, so if I were talking to global leaders today, I would be saying to them, what do you see? Do you see what we saw? Because you can connect these dots. You can connect the dots to the drying up of Lake Chad. There's no water up there. Well, look, you've got Boko Haram. You can connect these dots, okay? There's no work for these young people, okay? You got migration. Connect the dots, okay? Not long after Gaddafi was overthrown, you can connect the dots, okay? A lot of African countries, Niger, Nigeria, they're fighting now these Islamist groups, okay? So, I mean, if you can't connect those dots, then you probably should consider another vocation, okay? And it's not an African problem, it's a global problem, okay? Those guys who arm themselves, we're not trekking down to Namibia and Windhoek. They'd like to get here too. And I think they have more interest to get here than they do to get to Windhoek or Libreville. So let's be serious. It's a global problem, okay? And it requires global solutions. And it's whatever tag we want to put onto it, short-termism, et cetera, et cetera. Look, I'm a businessman. I serve on the board of Unilever. We talk long-term issues at Unilever.
Unilever is an outlier.
Well, you know, sorry?
Unilever is an outlier.
No, but it doesn't have to be the outlier. We've demonstrated that you can have sustainability as part of the business model. It's not an outlier. I sit on the B team group that we put together, again, to pull together business leaders around issues like carbon. How do we build new business models? Because however successful our business models sitting in this room, the reality is this change is so disruptive. We need to go back and rethink our models.
We do.
There's no part of this of society that gets left out of this.
The disappointing thing is that we're out of time. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you.